process of exporting your game from Unity and releasing it on Android and iOS and the kind of process of that. So yeah, as I said, it's going to be like covering those two areas, but also kind of delving a little deeper into the actual feature process. So talking about how you would go about getting, a spot in the App Store. Obviously, again, this is information that is kind of relevant to now and potentially, my experience of doing this. So, you know, these are the best practices I would recommend, but they're not absolutes. You will have certain situations where these won't necessarily work, or it's not a silver bullet. So let's kind of give a quick rundown of the two main storefronts. So there's the Apple App Store, and then there's the Android or Google Play Store. So the pros and cons of both, just to give a kind of a quick rundown of Apple's. They've got because the iPhone is more of a kind of an upmarket product. They have a more lucrative audience. This is reflected in things like the ad rates. So because of iPhones being a more expensive device, advertisers are willing to spend more money, on more kind of high-profile products to get ad revenue out of them. And as part of that, it's a more lucrative audience to have. And then as part of that as well, from a standardization perspective, it's pretty straightforward in that, it's become less straightforward more recently because Apple has actually started having, some differences in device. But for the most part, it's relatively standardized, the Apple setup. If you contrast this with Android, it's a lot harder to, have you can have your games run with certainty on a majority of Apple devices with very kind of relatively small amounts of adjustments to your UI elements. The only real exception for that is the newer phones, which have that silly notch at the top, which means that all of your UI has to be moved down by like 10, 15 pixels. And then also, I think one of their iPads has got the kind of curved edges, which shears off some of the UI. So, other than those two kind of irritating elements to design around, the majority of their phones don't have that issue. And even then, as it kind of transitions, if that becomes the standard, which hopefully it doesn't transition back to what it was before, because then there'll be this weird, awkward lump in the middle. If it becomes more the standard to have that notch at the top, then it'll be easier to design around. So there's that. If you contrast that with Android, there's I can't remember. I cannot. I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure it's something ridiculous, like 50,000 different models or something ridiculous like that. I could be potentially wrong on that, but it's a ridiculous number of models of potential Android phones and devices to factor in compared to Apple's, which is probably about maybe less than 100, which is a pretty substantial difference. As I said, I may be wrong on that second number, but I'm reasonably sure that that's the case. Even if not, it is definitely in the thousands versus hundreds. I'm pretty sure it's the number I mentioned before. And yeah, that can sometimes be taken to its extreme. Like one of my friends, he had a request from a player that asked for help with getting his games to run on their device. And it turned out that they had a square phone, so like all of the UI was like crushed together in the middle and wasn't working correctly. So yeah, you've got to kind of grapple with that kind of stuff. So having more or less standardization on Apple is quite beneficial. Yeah, and as a very recent development, Apple has announced that they have a 15% basically they've for users that earn less than $1 million a year, I believe it is. You only pay 15% compared to 30, which is what they charged before for their ad revenue share, or sorry, their in-app purchase revenue share, which is useful. It's really really useful. Although going into the cons, it may not be useful as as you'd hope. So from the offset, Apple is a much harder platform to penetrate in that you have to own one of their devices to test the game, and then also own one of their platforms. So, or they're one of their computers to be actually able to build stuff for their platform. So that in itself is probably going to set you out by possibly $1,000 if you're going for low end stuff. If you get like one of the Mac Minis, that's what I've got. That cost me around, I think it was like 500 quid, which is like, compared to the laptops and all that stuff, it's, I think about, the laptops are around $1,000. Those Mac Minis are, I think they are nearing the end of the, what's it called? The conveyor belt before they get ditched as a product, but you can export to iOS and they're relatively stable platforms to work with. So that's realistically your cheapest option, is to spend like $1,000, and then buying a middle of the road device. I wouldn't recommend for iOS development buying the most recent devices, because that means that you're not factoring in previous models, for backwards compatibility, and you're going to have a harder idea of what the device supports. So for example, in my case, I've got, I think it's an iPhone 5S or something like that. And that means that pretty much everything ahead of me is covered, other than things like the notch for the iPhone X's and beyond that you've got to plan around. As part of that cost, this upfront cost, there's also the cost to keep your games online. So this is kind of a bit of I think this is a bit of a messed up thing. Basically, if you keep for you to keep your games on the Apple Store year on year, you have to it's not only to publish on their platform, it's to keep your games up on their platform. So essentially you have to pay I think it's $99 a year for as long as you want those games to be live, to keep hosting your stuff on the storefront, which is essentially like a rent, like a yearly rent. And realistically in itself, if you're having a lucrative setup, for your game, I easily make more than £100 a year or $100 a year in revenue. That works out for me because it's paid itself off. But for people that are just starting out, that's a big commitment to make. And if your games exist on there, but you've got a very small, happy, quite content player base, it's a difficult situation if you have to make the decision of whether to renew or not based on a product that isn't actually making that much money for you. Apple, as well as part of this, is rather than kind of releasing your game and being done with it, Apple is kind of constantly purging their storefront. So you have to kind of, because they keep doing new operating systems and adjusting their specifications for what you need for the App Store, you have to keep updating your games. Ones that you've potentially not even touched in, like, there's games that I released like 5 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, that I'm still going to have to keep updating to keep them allowed on the App Store, which is, it's rubbish. That's a lot of time wasted, for those games that have, potentially like fizzled out, or just get like an average amount of traffic. It's not optimal. And as part of the playtesting process, it takes significantly longer than testing on Android, which is literally just like export to an APK and then out the door it goes. So yeah, for me, I've released most of my games on Apple. Oh, the other thing I'd say as a con as well as part of it is that um, the setup is a real faff. I'll be going into it more later, but it's a real faff to get your initial setup sorted for iOS. Um, I probably wouldn't have been able to do it without the support of some friends of mine that who used the same tool as me, who helped me with the process. Because it was just obnoxiously difficult, so much troubleshooting. To go into Android, the pros of it is that it's, in stark contrast to iOS. It's very very easy to access. So if you buy an Android device, you probably get one for less than £100. If you've already got a computer that exists, you're set. And their license is a one-off fee compared to a yearly fee. So once you've paid it, you're set for life, which is great. That's a lot more kind of conducive to allowing people on the platform and encouraging, actually, yeah, it's making less of a walled garden for people to access and develop for the platform. As I mentioned, the inverse of it's very straightforward to get started with. It doesn't take that long. You've literally, as you've gone through the process, you can export an APK in probably 10 minutes of setting up your project and have it running on your device in maybe 15 minutes. Compared to Apple, where you've got to go through all this like profiling and all this rubbish just to be able to play test your game on your device. So it's a much steeper learning curve. And yeah, the other thing is that what it lacks in terms of value of audience, Android, it gains in the size of its audience. So it has a colossal player base. So absolutely dwarfs the Apple's player base. But the catch with that is, whether you can access that player base. So, for example, there is, pretty significant Android bases. So like, base kind of platforms for Android, but they're in places like China, for example, where they're like closed, almost like closed loop platforms where they're kind of inside the country and you can't access them. Separate to Google Play. So yeah, there's a trade-off there, and then the other trade-off as part of this is by having that massive player base. Sorry, not by having the massive player base, by having the kind of low barrier for entry in terms of the cons. Like, it is heavily saturated, the platform. Like, it is very, 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 very heavily saturated, the platform, which makes it a lot harder to get features, and in general is a much, even with, if you can get past the walled garden of Apple, there is a path to getting featured. But for Google, whilst it's easy to get set up on, it's much harder to get featured. Beyond that as well, because Google doesn't have the complex authoring process of Apple, it's significantly easier for pirated content to not only be pirated and pirated content for it to exist on their devices. It's also possible for people to literally steal your games and pirate them, and release them as products that people will download. Like, I've had mates that have had their games literally stolen and re-uploaded, kind of almost like the old Flash days where people would download your SWF and upload it to other websites and take the revenue. Almost like app poaching, so to speak. So those things are a lot more prevalent on Android than they are on iOS. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of different devices to worry about and to think about in terms of having your game ported to different stuff. So in some cases, it's better to just kind of cut off swathes of devices just to save yourself the faff of having your inbox full of people complaining that it can't run on their their device from like 2010 or whatever, or even earlier, technically. Um, and as part of that, there's a lot more kind of hoops to jump through to get your features. I'll be going into some of those as we go along, but it requires a lot of more upfront stuff. Apple's feature process is relatively straightforward. You send them a message with in good time with details about your launch and you as a company. By contrast, Google requires that you launch. You do a soft launch essentially, and then you provide them with stats. You've got to have a minimum crash rate. There's loads of different, and you've got to have a load of features implemented. So there's a lot higher barrier. For context, I've released seven. I can't remember, 6, 7 games on iOS, and I've released 0 on Android just because I just can't be bothered with it's just such a faff to set up getting stuff featured and posted. And then the other thing which has kind of put me off releasing on there as well is the fact that you need a public address for if you have any kind of in-app purchases or transactions in your game, which means most of the time that you have to put your home address, particularly for you lot starting out. The only official address you're going to have is your own property. So, and they won't accept PO boxes, so it has to be a legitimate address, which means that if you did have a very successful game, you now have your extremely private information on that storefront put out to thousands of customers. So that's been one of my other reservations about releasing on their store. So kind of digging into Android itself, as I mentioned before, in terms of equipment you'd need, it's just a one-off license, which is pretty straightforward to sign up for, an Android device, and obviously I would say that's preferable to an emulator, but you can get away with just using emulation software, and then you just need a Google account. From there, you just need to create a key store, and this is basically like a means of kind of protecting the game from being pirated. This is a lot less secure than what is on the App Store, but that's their kind of basic process of vetting your game. As part of this, what you do is you create your developer certificate, which you can access through the settings. There's several components of that you add. So there's things like the developer name, the icon, and the game name. But there's also this thing called the bundle identifier. So this is a thing that exists on iOS, and it also exists on Android. So this is a reverse domain, which is as you can see here, it's com.alex.game, which is it always starts with this, and then it's the developer, and then the game itself, and that's basically a way of identifying you as a developer. And then from there, you just have a password to kind of, as I said, reduce the likelihood of piracy. And this little drop down here, you need to make sure is correctly designated. It won't do it by default. And then you just build out. You can actually export without filling this stuff out, but if you want to publish to the storefront, you'll need to fill that out. As part of the upload process, you need to have, as I mentioned, an account. And then from there, once you've set up your account and kind of got it associated with all the developer-related stuff, you then need to kind of add a new app, fill out the various information, various details as part of that, and then when you've done that, what it'll do is you'll have this interface, which I personally despise, just because the way that the information is arranged is horrible. I don't understand why the essential information isn't bunched at the top. It's very obnoxious as a layout. There's other pet peeves I have with it, but yeah. it took me ages to figure out, what needed to be filled out here. The only ones that you need to fill out to be able to release on the storefront is these ones. So the ones that have ticks are like absolutely required. So things like the content rating, if I remember correctly, it's stuff like it's stuff like your age rating essentially. So does it have violence, drug references, gambling, all that stuff. The app content is things like, do you have microtransactions in? Do you have ads that are unsuitable for kids? Do you have are you securely storing people's data, stuff like that, or using people's data in the process of your game. And then the rest are pretty self-explanatory. One thing I would definitely recommend is with the store listing. This is where you kind of put all of your icons and screenshots and all the kind of nice elements of it. It makes a pretty substantial difference to having a video associated with your game. I've never released a game without a video, and I've never, as far as I know, I've not downloaded a game pretty much ever without there being a video, unless it's something that I've kind of gone for before knowing that I need. It's a pretty high what's the word, indicator of whether someone will download your game or not, as if they can see it in action. So I would recommend, as part of the process of either at least getting some gameplay, if not getting a trailer produced. So from here, if you go onto, I think it's this section here at the top, you see app releases. You click on that, it'll take you to this page here where you've got the various stages of kind of exporting your game, so or publishing your game rather. So as part of that, you've got your alpha, beta, production, and internal. I missed that one there. And you kind of move the game along those various steps of release state. And one thing that I found very confusing when I was going through this is that they use the term published for each of those states, when it's usually only referring to that specific step of the state. So for example, you will be asked if you want to publish the alpha, but it'll only say, do you want to publish this? And yeah, for me, like that was very intimidating, because I really, really did not want to put my game live before it was fully tested and vetted. So yeah, that can be a little bit misleading, but as long as you kind of you make sure that you check that stuff over before you send it, as long as you're kind of designating it to the right section, you should be fine. One thing to note is that you do need to be in beta to be able to share it with other people. Otherwise, you've got to go through the internal process of sharing it by email, which is kind of irritating, and you're only able to kind of share it with a very limited number of people. So that's relatively straightforward. As I said, I've never got past the beta stage with this, mainly because, as I said, I've just been kind of there's not really been any incentive for me to actually release, because it's one of those weird things that, this is a slight aside, but because I'm set up with iOS and I have my process, and because I've consistently made money from getting featured on that platform, there's less incentive for me to go through the faff and the process of releasing on Android, if that is going to cause me more problems than what it's worth. As a great example, do I want my address putting online? Do I want to go through the faff of finding an office address? Do I want the faff of having a very small number of people download the game and them all be complaining at me because it's not working on their devices? It's just, I just don't know if I can be bothered with that. But for you lot at your early stages in your careers, I think that releasing on this platform releasing on Android is significantly better, because it's very low cost, allows you to iterate and experiment, and make those mistakes before you have to invest and make all of the high investments of getting Android iOS devices and stuff like that. One tool that is really useful that kind of Google has available, which is what's known as A/B testing, which is where you can kind of put up either stuff like an app icon or your promotional content, or you can essentially have audiences engage with elements of your project and have it's almost like a kind of a Tinder system where you pick between one of two options, and that kind of informs your design decisions. So they'll be presented with two options. If they pick one, that'll be kind of fed back to you, and you can use that to make the decision that affects the widest net of people. As part of that as well, that's really useful because you can kind of like it's common that when people put stuff live, that there's stuff that they've missed, or like you have this very tight window to make as much money as you can and as much impact as you can in a very short period of time. So trialing that stuff out before it goes live, and making sure you've got like peak engagement when your game goes public, is literally the difference between a game being a success or a failure, with it being such a narrow window to launch in. On top of that as well, on Android, you've got the option to go for a soft release. You can do this on iOS as well, but like Android's a little bit kind of more facilitated to it. And from a feature perspective, Apple likes you to tell them if when you're going to be launching, and for you to not what's the word? Like launch before that they've consulted with you, and as part of actually getting featured on Google, as I mentioned before, you need to have actually launched and to kind of give them like the engagement data and how many crashes you've had. I think if it exceeds 1% crash, you can't get a feature until you've like remedied those issues. For your kind of stages in your careers, it may be actually beneficial to go through the process of soft launch so you can kind of iron out all those kinks, and rather than just kind of like risking it and just throwing it out there with mistakes built in. It's better to kind of test it on a smaller audience and then give it a full shot when it's ready. So as part of the feature process for Google, as I said, there is a much higher standard requirement. So as I mentioned before, you've got to have soft launched. You can't have a high crash rate. As I mentioned as well, make sure you build a trailer because it makes a pretty substantial difference to engagement. And in the case of Google, if you go through their program, which I don't know, it may have stopped running. I assume it's probably still going, but they've got like a kind of a startup program for kind of new Android developers that allow you to actually release the games on Google Play, and at the end of that, you can then get like a feature and technical support and all that stuff. I've had friends go through it and they've said it was pretty useful. And as part of this, you can end up making contacts at Google. I've got several contacts at Google through the process of doing that. As I said, I've not followed it through to its conclusion. I've given you the reasons of why that's the case. So let's move on to iOS. So in terms of what you need for iOS, you need a games developer license, which is $100 a year, and that is paid yearly, so it's not a one-off license. You need an Apple computer. People are able to kind of do parallels and all sorts of mirroring nonsense. And whilst you may be able to test on like a jailbroken mobile device, or even get it to, I actually don't know if you can get it to a mobile device. You might be able to, but I'm not sure. You can't get it on the store. Like Apple has enough stuff in place to make it so you can't release on their store with that. As part of that as well, you need an Apple device. The alternative as well, which is quite useful, is Apple has built into their computers. Most people don't use it, but they've got Xcode, which is their app development platform for like exporting. It's similar to Android Studio, basically. And you can use that to emulate games. And I would say the most important thing that you need for releasing an iOS is significant patience. So compared to Android, the certificate process is a lot more intense and kind of time consuming and brain consuming, because they want to make sure that there's, for a long time Apple's kind of prided itself on having like a secure platform. That has changed in the last few years. It's becoming increasingly more vulnerable to attack, just because there's more people interested in exploiting those audiences, and still Apple has these kind of significant checks to make sure that stuff is suitable for the App Store, and also is harder to pirate and steal. So as part of the various things you'll need, so you need a certificate. So that certificate is what you get when you register to release on the App Store. You then use that certificate you download that to your device, and you have that in your key store, which is this like program that is set up on your computer that stores all your passwords. You then create an app ID, which is like your whatever your game is. You'll give it a name, and then you'll include the reverse domain that I mentioned before. You then have your provisioning profiles. So once you've created that app ID, you create provisioning profiles for what platforms or what platforms you want to release on. So what I mean by that isn't like Android or iOS or PlayStation. It's like, do you want to do like an ad hoc test? So like testing just within a small knit of people, and the App Store. So do you want to be able to use this profile to release mass market? From what I understand, you need both of these, ad hoc and App Store provisioning profile, to be able to release on the platform. I'm not 100% sure on that. You definitely need the one for the App Store. Since they've done Test Flight, which is their kind of testing service, there's less need for kind of the ad hoc system, which used to be previously that you would get people's emails and like send out manual. You'd send them out individual keys of your game manually rather than just sending them a link. So again, this is less relevant now, but you have to have like a registered device list. So something like Android's APK system, where you can just take any random Joe's device and put a APK on it and it'll work. You have to have a device that is willing to kind of is able to be accept the game, and you go through the Apple developer site to do this, and then once you've kind of created all those various elements, you then download them to Xcode, and then you can use your then you link all the stuff via Unity, and then you can then export. So it's a very, very complicated process, and that is assuming that you have got it right. I, by contrast, had a lot of back and forth dealing with like provisioning profiles not being recognized or found, or things expiring. That's a one I absolutely hate, is that your provisioning profiles and the various elements expire because of the annual license. So you have to renew them every year, which means that if you've not released games and you have like all your information, you've got to renew it. So it's a huge faff. This is why I would recommend Android starting out over iOS, just because it's such a faff dealing with all this stuff. It does definitely get easier once you've been through the process for the first time, but the first few times it's horrible. I won't mince words on that. So from a playtesting perspective, previously it used to be a real faff to test on iOS. It still is arguably a bit now, but it's less so than it was. So what you do is, rather than just being able to kind of get your great APK and just send it out to whoever you fancy, you have to upload it to TestFlight. So there is this thing called the application loader, where you have to export your IPA. That is then sent to the application loader. You have to make sure you have the right version number. You have to make sure that it accepts it. If it doesn't accept it being uploaded through the application loader, it'll reject it, and you'll have to make some kind of adjustment or change. Again, a lot of back and forth on that. And then when it does make it through and it gets uploaded, you then have to submit that to Apple. They then review it. So that's the initial review. Then you kind of add testers, provide questions. That's then vetted again. And then once that's cleared for release, that's then distributed to playtesters. You can then gather feedback from them, and you can also create a public link where you can then finally just distribute that to whoever you fancy who has a device. And yeah, after that you can then take a well-earned rest, because at that point you're more or less through the hardest part of the app development process. Once you've got it on people's devices, it's just a matter of updating the builds, and then eventually choosing which build you want to submit as your launch copy. So, and then you've got your review after that as well, which you need to make sure you fill out correctly. Yeah, but it gets easier once you've gone through that initial setup, which is horrible. Another thing to note is that your testers, again, it's not as easy as just sending them a link. They also have to have TestFlight downloaded, which is an app that Apple provides, and then they can download the app through that via the email link that they receive, or via a notification they'll get when a new app is added to TestFlight. So in terms of the feature process, what I'll quickly say first is you need to factor in time for the review. So I haven't mentioned anything about this here, but the review process for Apple, you need to allow a decent chunk of time for them to, I would say allow a week, if you can, to get your game approved before it launches. Some mates of mine, they won't launch a game, so they won't contact Apple with their release date for their game until they've got it reviewed and kind of primed for launch from Apple, just so that they don't waste their feature slot. So yeah, I've had it before. I think I had to do it for my first game that I released, Narcissus. I had to do a fix in the space of, I think it was less than a week till launch, and I was going abroad for when the launch was happening. So I had to literally, it was down to the wire for me to submit this, and I didn't know whether it was going to go live before the launch happened, the change. So that was horrifying. And that would have been a game-breaking bug as well. I think that, if I remember correctly, I think it was that it kept loading ads into the game once you disabled the ads. So it didn't show ads, but it kept loading them in. So people that paid to remove ads, it broke the game, because eventually it would have too many ads loaded and it would crash. So you'd get to 5 or 6 deaths and then the game would crash. So that was catastrophic, and it had to be fixed with days to go, which could have been a complete disaster. Thankfully, the App Store team, depending on what time of year it is and even what day of the week it is, it can vary how quickly they respond, but allowing at least a week is a good idea. Apple, in terms of its feature process, it's sometimes, as I said, this is all my personal experience, so take it with a pinch of salt, but they have the kind of evangelicals that go around sorry, not evangelicals, sorry, evangelists. Uh, I mean, yeah. Anyway, but evangelists that go around and kind of preach, the new features of the game of the device and how the new gimmicks and stuff that it comes up with. And often they'll ask you to, if you're interested in integrating those features. One of the first games that I released, Puff, an example of that was that we had the recording button built into the game, which was there. I can't remember what it was called. It was called like Screen. It was like Screen Share or something. I can't remember what it was. There was a fancy or Screen. I can't remember what it was. It was a fancy name, but we included that function in there to kind of get on Apple's radar. People have used things like the AR stuff to get in on the wave of features when they came out. People have done things like 3D touch, which again, kind of a gimmick that people are willing to kind of engage with to be able to get features. So that's a potential path to getting featured. They can be useful. Just being able to kind of get a foot in the door with Apple is quite useful. Having a contact at Apple is kind of less of a useful thing now. I can't say that for sure because the contacts that I've had previously, I keep getting featured, and I've not needed to use them as much anymore. It used to be a pretty backward system for getting featured, which was basically you would contact a rep at Apple, and then you would get an Excel spreadsheet that you would have to fill out with a bunch of information in, which you then send back to them, and then you'd give them your length of time, and then you'd find out if you got featured on the day. They've kind of, I wouldn't say democratized because it is pretty still a bit of a walled garden in terms of getting a feature, but rather than it being these kind of like backroom sign-ups that you're getting, they've got a form that you can, basically anyone with a developer account can access and submit their information to, and it's around about the same information that you were giving before. As part of it, personally, I think giving, as I said, a good wedge of time to let them find a feature is a good idea. In this presentation, I've got 6 to 8 weeks. The reason that's the case is because there was a period of time where Apple upped it to that length of time. As of right now, they've dropped it back down to 2 to 3 weeks, which is a blessing because if 6 to 8 weeks is 2 months. So if you're like dying on the vine at a point when you submit your game to Apple, you've then got to survive for 2 months on basically no income, on the chance that you might get featured. Whilst at least 3 weeks, that's within like a paycheck or whatever. You do still have to wait a month afterwards to get paid, but if you think about having to wait 2 months for your game to launch, and then have to wait at least a month to then get paid. By some ad providers, that's 60 days as well. So literally, you could be looking at like 4 months in the old system to wait to be paid, which is just terrifying. So that's good. A lot of because the kind of games journalism is like, I mean, it's not just games journalism. Journalism in general is like in kind of terminal decline at the moment because of the kind of what's the word, devaluing of ads, and journalism in general being something that people are less willing to pay for nowadays. A lot of games journalists are being scooped up by Apple. They used to give what's the word? Affiliate. They used to give like affiliate links to journalistic platforms, so things like Touch Arcade or Pocket Gamer, platforms like that. They've now kind of axed all that stuff now, so those platforms are basically stuffed. So a lot of journalists that previously did that, or journalists more kind of widely in games, are now hired directly from Apple so that they can kind of curate their platforms with these kind of arbiters of games journalism. So with that in mind, approaching them or kind of writing this pitch as if you're kind of pitching it to a journalist can be a good idea. So like, for example, they have a section on like why you as a developer should be featured, or rather like what's your kind of story, like what's your, what's the ideas behind the game, what inspired you, what's the makeup of your team, stuff like that. Like, so for example, with me for Narcissus, the inspiration for the game came from watching my brother jumping across stepping stones as a kid, and seeing the reflections in the water, or seeing his reflection jumping across the rocks at the same time, or Corporate Salmon, me being inspired by building custom controllers, and then also being in New York at the time and seeing the kind of the kind of capitalist the capitalist skyline, and all the greed of Wall Street and stuff like that. So like talking about that stuff, like giving a narrative to the games that you're submitting, can inform the curation process. So as part of that, there's this link that I've provided for you to go with. As I said, you need to be registered to see it. And as you'll know from my previous presentation that I did, you should take this all with a pinch of salt. The App Store is a shell, I would argue, of what it used to be in terms of what you could make. Several years ago, I was making pretty consistently, as I said, Corporate Salmon made like nearly 20 grand. Actually, no, it made more. It made more than 20 grand. Well, by contrast, my last two apps, I think, have like collectively made less than 10, I think. And my last one got like one of the best slots in the world, like on the App Store, in that it got up to like the top 10 in the US for sports games, and like was behind Tetris on the general rankings, and was like the #1 spot for new games we love. So like, it doesn't get much better than that, and that made less than 5K on launch, which is like kind of really sets the bar for like what to expect from a feature. It's definitely not a kingmaker anymore. That's kind of long gone. Like as a kind of retirement money style thing. I'm still going to keep releasing games, but it is by no means a way of making a living now. I don't think so. Do keep that all in mind, and keep all the advice I've given above with it. Take it with a pinch of salt. As I said before, the thing that you kind of get from these features is you've got your initial feature, but then you have kind of features kind of going afterwards as well, like repeat features. That's kind of where I nowadays see a lot of my money from features. As I said, things like Apple Arcade and their recent drop of this fee are kind of helping to facilitate it. But for me, until they really start bringing the new games we love stuff back up the listings, it's just going to be terminal decline. So take that in mind. Some other things to think about is, as you'll be doing as part of the submission, you'll be making sure that you factor in time for weird scaling for devices, making sure it's scaling correctly to different devices, and for weird notches and weird elements. As part of the new EU regulations for GDPR, which I believe the UK will be accepting, and kind of carrying over regardless of whether there's a Brexit deal. Those protections for digital users' rights is kind of enshrined. So you need a privacy policy to kind of ensure that your customers are aware of what they're giving away when they sign up to your game. Because if you have a game, for example, with advertisements in, you are using their data to serve them advertisements. So it's something that you have to fill out, or something rather that you have to fill out and purchase. Um, yeah, and that's usually like a yearly cost. And as I said, you need to keep updating them with regular information. Um, and then as part of that as well, you need to fill out a tax form, and this is kind of the wider thing of um, becoming a sole trader. Because if you are making money from a platform, you are essentially doing business, and you need to have that factored in for taxes. Um, the form that this is on the right hand side, I believe, I can't remember if this is the case. I think this basically avoids you having double taxation, which means that you pay taxes in the country that you're from rather than also in the US. Um, yeah, so you fill that out. The way it works is if you fill it out incorrectly with Apple, you then have to go directly through like the IRS and their kind of tax, the actual tax entities. So you have to make sure that you really, really, really fill it out correctly, because otherwise it makes things a hell of a lot harder. Registering as a sole trader is very straightforward. The only complication is filling out a tax self-assessment every year. If you're not doing too much in terms of trading, the good thing is with um, trading as a sole, as an app developer, as a sole trader, is most of you're not having to deal with like individual transactions like most people would get on like a what's the word, like on a storefront, or in a market, for example. You're not dealing with thousands of individual transactions. You're dealing with lump sums that you're paid from these platforms, so things like Google and Apple, or whatever your ad provider is. So it is pretty straightforward. I've filled out several years of kind of self-assessment returns before, but you shouldn't worry about this until you're in a position where you are like making a decent chunk of money. Don't preemptively do this until you're like reasonably certain that you're going to release, and that also you're in with a shot of maybe getting a feature. If you're just releasing your games for free, you don't really even need to bother with it, to be honest. And as I said before, with Android, you need a business address. So whether that's you find an office space and use that, or you take the risk and use your home address. Personally, I'm not willing to make that to do that. So probably for the foreseeable future, I won't be releasing my stuff on Android, just because for me that's a red line. I don't want that piece of information putting online. Cool. So that's basically everything I want to talk about. If you have any other questions, just feel free to hit me up. And other than that, I do hope genuinely that some of you, off the back of going through these videos, do kind of follow up your development for this beyond just doing what's required for the module, either just from as a solid portfolio piece, or just the satisfaction and catharsis of actually releasing a game. It is a tremendous amount of fun reading reviews from people. Obviously, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword at times, but it is a real thrill releasing a game, and if it does well, it's really fun. I've had like lots of people get in touch with me and say how much it's meant for them to play my games. Like I've had family friends that say that they're like their kids have like named their like school groups of friends after like some of the they call themselves the corporate salmons and stuff like that. Like that stuff's really fun. So yeah, I would genuinely encourage, if you think that you've got something that is polished enough and compelling to release it, you might as well. And you can realistically with these platforms reach tens of thousands of people. At this point I've reached over 2 million people, which is just it's just ridiculous. If you think about a lot of other mediums, like to reach that number of people, it's almost on like a par with if you think about it in terms of books or publications, that's a staggering number of people to reach. Obviously, it's not in terms of like payments, but still, that's a lot of influence that you wield if you can, get your games in front of those people. Cool. Well, yeah, best of luck with getting your submissions done. And yeah, as I said, I hope you'll consider pursuing them after the the submission process.